They called her the Float. Not by name. Not most of the time. 8 months at St. Michael's and Elena Martinez had become a phantom, rotating through units on shifts no one else wanted, appearing on schedules like a glitch, vanishing by evening. The hospital in San Antonio ran on fluorescent light and the quiet hum of systems that never stopped. Elena moved through its corridors like someone who understood that invisibility was a choice, a useful one. She was folding trauma bay linens at 0530 when she saw Drive Pierce walk past the first time. He didn't look at her. Nobody did. But Elena noticed him notice the way her hands worked the corners, hospital sharp, precise as flag ceremony folds. She pulled the white linen taut, then folded it again, and again, until the creases held like knife cuts. Military precision applied to something so mundane that it looked like fastidiousness, the obsession of a nurse with too much time and not enough meaning. The locker in the break room on the 3rd floor, the one no one used because it stuck, held everything she kept. A change of shoes. A compact mirror. And in the back corner, wrapped in clear plastic and folded so carefully that the creases had creases, a flag that had traveled 7,400 miles from the Hindu Kush and never been claimed by anyone who was supposed to own it. Pierce saw her 3 days later during the chart review. He was one of those doctors who moved through hospitals the way some men move through rooms at parties, aware of every hierarchy, every person beneath him, every small sin he could weaponize. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never being questioned. 52 years old, wedding band that looked like it had been worn by generations of men who looked exactly like him, the sort of voice that made residents flinch before he even spoke. Elena was at the nursing station, her hands moving through charts with the same precision she used on linens. She'd spotted the discrepancy during routine documentation, a billing code for surgical supplies that didn't match the procedure Dr. Pierce had billed for that morning. Specifically, 3 titanium reconstruction plates worth $8,400 total when the surgery he'd documented only required standard surgical mesh. She was making a note when she saw him approaching. Dr. Pierce. She looked up from the chart, her voice even. Professional. The voice of someone who understood her place in the order of things. Nurse Martinez, is it? He'd never called her by name before. The fact that he knew it should have been her first warning. Do you have a question about my documentation? She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She'd learned long ago that flinching invited follow-up, and follow-up invited disaster. The billing code here. It doesn't match the operative report. I might have missed something. His jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough that someone trained to read the small signs, and Elena had been trained, would catch it. He took the chart from her hands without asking, his eyes scanning the lines she'd highlighted. 8 seconds passed. The fluorescent lights hummed their 60 Hz frequency above them. Someone down the hallway called a code, muffled through 3 sets of double doors. You have a suggestion, Nurse Martinez? His voice had shifted. It was lower now, which meant danger. She'd learned the gradations of male aggression the way other people learned languages. This was fluent. No, sir. Just wanted to verify. He closed the chart slowly. Verification. Right. Because nurses verify physicians. He smiled, and the smile was the worst part. Not angry. Confident. The smile of someone who had never, not once in his life, faced actual consequences. I'll adjust the code. Though I'm not sure administration appreciates unsolicited chart audits from the float staff. He set the chart down and walked away. Elena watched him go, watching the way he moved toward the attending physician's lounge, watching the way he picked up his phone before the doors closed behind him. She didn't move. Her hands remained on the station. Her face remained still. This was the first instinct of someone trained in real danger. Don't look away, don't show fear, don't make it interesting. The flag in her locker had been folded by different hands once. Sergeant Major had carried it back from Cunha Province wrapped in a medical trauma bag, pressed against his chest during a medevac flight, kept it in his footlocker for 18 years waiting for someone to come looking for it. The creases had pressed deeper over time. The fabric had faded from red to rust in places where it had been handled too many times. Elena had taken it once, at a forward operating base surrounded by mountains the color of old blood, and she'd asked him to keep it safe. Said she was going to come back and claim it. She never went back to claim it. Pierce started watching her after that. Not obviously. He was too smart for obvious. But Elena felt it, the weight of his attention in hallways, the way his eyes tracked her movements during shift changes, the way he'd pause at her station and scan her charts when she stepped away. He was cataloging something. Building a case. She'd seen this behavior before, in officers who suspected something but couldn't prove it, who needed to gather evidence before making a move. On the 5th day, he found her in the supply closet restocking the crash cart. She was placing medications in the exact order they'd been needed during a code, epinephrine first, then atropine, then amiodarone in the proper sequence, when his shadow fell across the open door. "You've done this a lot," he said. "Not a question. Just organization." Elena didn't turn around. She placed the last medication and closed the medication drawer with a soft click. "Less time searching during a code. You seem very comfortable with emergency protocol." His voice had that quality again, the controlled patience of a predator. "Most float nurses need training. I read the manuals." He stepped into the closet. It was a small space, and he was using that, the way men like him used space, as a territory to be occupied. "I wonder," he said, "if there's something in your background that makes you particularly suited to emergency situations." Elena turned to face him. This was the moment where most people would have looked away, would have deferred, would have shown something. Instead, her eyes met his with the flat, colorless stare of someone who had already decided what she would die for and what she wouldn't. It was a look that registered as wrong to him. He was used to fear. He was used to supplication. He wasn't used to the absence of both. "I try to be competent," she said. "At whatever I'm assigned. Competence is good. Overreach is something else." He paused. "If you ever feel tempted to step outside your scope, Nurse Martinez, you should know that administration takes that very seriously. I have relationships with every member of the credentialing committee. Everyone. So it would be a tragedy if something in your file became an issue." It wasn't a threat. Threats were crude. This was something more refined, a demonstration of the network he'd activate, the calls he'd make, the small administrative moves that could erase someone's career before they even understood what was happening. Elena had seen this kind of power before, but in different uniforms, different settings. The infrastructure was always the same. "I understand," she said. "Good." He smiled again, that confident smile. "Glad we understand each other." After he left, Elena sat on the plastic stool in the supply closet for 90 seconds. She didn't shake. Didn't cry. Her hands remained steady on her knees. Instead, she thought about the flag in her locker, how the creases had become permanent, how plastic wrap can preserve something but can't keep it alive. She thought about Sergeant Major in the Hindu Kush, pressing it against his chest. She thought about the fact that she'd been gone from that life for so long that when she died, there wouldn't be anyone to press anything against their chest for her. The break room locker was cold when she opened it that evening. The flag was exactly where she'd left it, protected in plastic, folded into a rectangle that was smaller than a human hand but heavier than anything her body could carry. She held it for maybe 5 seconds, then placed it back in the darkness. The flag sat in the darkness of her locker for exactly 23 seconds before Elena closed the door and turned back toward the ICU ward. She had work to do. A float nurse at St. Michael's didn't get to indulge in the weight of folded fabric and impossible memories. She didn't get to stand in the locker room and let her hands shake. That was the deal she'd made 8 months ago when she walked through the employee entrance with a manufactured resume and no history before June. Invisible meant untouchable, and untouchable meant alive. The hospital corridor at 6:02 a.m. smelled like industrial bleach and the copper-sweet stench of overnight drainage bags. Her sneakers squeaked on the tile as she pushed toward the amphitheater. Grand round started at 7 o'clock. Dr. Pierce had requested her presence. That was how he phrased it to the charge nurse, requested, not demanded, which meant it wasn't optional and everyone knew it. The amphitheater held 53 medical students and residents in tiered seating that descended toward a central stage where the attending physicians delivered their verdicts on the nurses, the residents, the protocol failures that cluttered the morning. Elena stood at the back, hands clasped in front of her scrubs, spine straight. She had learned a long time ago that posture was armor. Military training had taught her that. 8 months of invisibility had refined it. Dr. Pierce stood at the podium with the projection screen flickering behind him. He was tall, 6'2", Armani under his white coat, the kind of man whose presence made junior residents sit forward and take notes. His hair was silver at the temples in a way that suggested expensive grooming. He smiled when he saw Elena enter, and that smile looked like a knife showing teeth. "Let's discuss protocol violations," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man who had already decided the outcome. "This case from yesterday afternoon. Post-operative patient, 48 hours after abdominal resection. Vital signs stable by every clinical parameter." And yet, he paused for effect, letting the audience lean in. Nurse Martinez here refused to discharge him. The screen lit up with the patient's chart. Heart rate 101. Blood pressure 118/72. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air. Temperature 37.4 Celsius. Everything textbook normal. The patient, Pierce continued, had a slightly elevated resting heart rate. Nurse Martinez deemed this catastrophic. She demanded further observation. She countermanded my discharge order based on her professional assessment that his vitals were unstable. He turned to look directly at Elena, and the smile widened. "Let me ask this room a simple question. Where did Nurse Martinez attend medical school?" Laughter rippled through the amphitheater like water spreading from a stone. Residents twisted in their seats to stare at her. Elena kept her face level, her breathing steady. She had seen this before. Not in hospitals, but in interrogation rooms during Joint Task Force Bravo training exercises. The technique was the same: public humiliation, authority display, audience participation to amplify the isolation. "Protocol exists," Pierce said, turning back to the screen, "so that nursing staff assess and report. So that physicians make clinical decisions. Not so nurses can practice internal medicine in their imagination." He clicked to the next slide, a protocol document, highlighted in red. Nurse Martinez violated this on every count. She questioned a discharge order. She made diagnostic assertions. She, in short, confused her station with her ambition. The residents took notes. Elena watched them write. 53 people learning, right now, that she was someone whose judgment could be publicly dismantled, whose presence could be used as a cautionary tale. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone above her head. When the lecture ended, Pierce made eye contact with her one more time and nodded slightly. The nod of a man who had delivered a message and expected acknowledgement of its receipt. 3 days passed. Elena worked recovery and trauma intake and the pediatric unit on rotating assignments, the float nurse's curse, sent wherever coverage was needed, never building relationships, never becoming part of a department. No one remembered her name on the 3rd day. She was float or you or sometimes just a gesture in her direction. The vending machine incident happened at 2:17 p.m. on a Wednesday, right at the peak of shift change when maximum foot traffic moved through the main corridor like a current. Elena was getting coffee, a habit she'd formed in the Afghan mountains, for cups a day, the routine itself a kind of meditation. She fed $3 into the slot and waited for the cup to drop. Pierce arrived with 4 residents. Their laughter preceded them down the hallway. He saw her at the machine and altered his course like a predator recognizing prey. "Still playing Dr. Martinez?" His voice was pitched loud enough for the gathering crowd, loud enough for the 2 nurses near the water fountain to turn around, loud enough for the orderly moving a blood sample cart to stop and listen. Elena turned, coffee cup in hand. She met his eyes and held them. No greeting, no deflection. Just a cold flat stare that had been honed in situations where eye contact was the only language that mattered. "You're a nurse," Pierce said, stepping closer. His residents formed a semicircle around them, phones already in hands. "A good one, maybe. But a nurse. The stethoscope around your neck doesn't make you a physician any more than a mop makes a janitor an engineer." The residents laughed on cue. The crowd growing around them had the texture of a public execution. Elena could smell Pierce's aftershave, something expensive and aggressive, something that smelled like entitlement. "Next time you countermand one of my discharge orders," Pierce said, his voice dropping to something intimate and lethal, "I'll have security escort you from this building. Do we understand each other?" Elena let the silence stretch. 1 second. 2. 3. 4. 5. In that span of 5 seconds, she watched his jaw tighten, watched him realize that his threat had landed on her the way rain lands on glass, present, visible, entirely ineffective. "The only thing more dangerous than your ego, Dr. Pierce, is your competence," she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. It came out with the precision of someone stating a clinical fact, the kind of observation that couldn't be argued with because it was simply true. The residents' laughter died. Elena turned on her heel and walked away, and the crowd parted for her like water, and nobody moved to follow because the atmosphere had changed. She had violated the script. She wasn't supposed to answer. She was supposed to nod and accept and internalize the humiliation the way protocol-obedient nurses were supposed to do. Instead, she had answered with the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose and no reason to pretend otherwise. Pierce stood frozen at the vending machine, his face darkening like a bruise spreading beneath his skin. One of the residents whispered something. He didn't respond. He was calculating, Elena knew. Reassessing her threat level. By Friday, he was calling her Captain Obvious in front of the resident lounge. Captain Obvious flagged another medication discrepancy. "Someone get her a medal." The nickname spread like infection through the hospital's informal communications network. By Monday, she was a joke told in the break room, a cautionary tale about nurses who overstepped. The humiliation had a rhythm now, systematic, consistent, designed to isolate and diminish. She worked the next 7 shifts without incident. The vending machine comment had marked her, and Mark made targets. Everyone kept distance. That was fine. Distance was familiar. Distance was how she had survived before. Then the sergeant major arrived on a Tuesday evening via ambulance from Lackland Air Force Base, and everything else stopped mattering. The intake report came across the ICU board at 8:43 p.m. Email, 54, post-surgical complications, IED injury sequelae, being transferred from trauma surgery. Elena scanned the name and froze. Davies, Thomas. Sergeant Major Davies. She told herself it was a common name. There were probably 17 Sergeant Major Davieses in the armed forces. The chances were statistically minimal that this was. But when they wheeled him into bed in the ICU, she looked at his face and knew. Older, yes. Grayer, definitely. 2 new scars she didn't recognize. But the eye line was identical. The shape of his jaw. The Marine Corps tattoo on his left shoulder that she had seen him get in Kandahar in 2012 when they were both still who they used to be. This was Corporal Davies. Now Sergeant Major Davies. The surgical team left the bedside after 20 minutes of handoff. Elena stood in the corner, chart in her hands, trying to control her breathing. His personal effects were in a clear plastic bag on the side table. She stepped closer to it. Through the transparent material, she could see folded fabric. Red, white, blue. The precise military fold. A tricolored triangle of weighted memory. Her hand started to shake. She had given him that flag. She had pressed it into his hands the day before she was extracted from Kuna province, the day her entire identity was erased from every official roster. "You're replacing me," she had said. "You carry this. You come home with this. That's the deal." And he had nodded, understanding without needing explanation that some things transcended rank and protocol, that some things were sacred enough to override every other priority. She reached out to touch the plastic, and her vision blurred. Fraternizing with Patience, Martinez. Pierce's voice came from directly beside her. She hadn't heard him approach. That was a mistake. That was the kind of mistake that got people killed, and she knew immediately that she had made it. That's a new violation. Elena straightened, pulling every layer of composure back into place like a soldier reaching for body armor. Professional mask back on. Invisible again. Just reviewing his chart, Doctor. Pierce took the chart from her hands with deliberate slowness. I'll handle this case personally. You're reassigned to post-op recovery. Effective immediately. She should have nodded and left. Should have accepted the reassignment without comment, the way a float nurse was supposed to behave. Instead, she looked at him, and something in her expression made him step back slightly. It was just a fraction of a movement, barely visible, but it was there. A momentary recognition that the calculation had shifted. Understood, Elena said. She turned and walked out of the ICU, and Pierce watched her go with the expression of a man who had just realized he had triggered something far more dangerous than a protocol violation. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Elena had spent the last 12 years being erased, and she had spent the last 8 months being invisible, but she had never, not once, forgotten who she was underneath. And now that person was awake. The sergeant major arrived at St. Michael's at 2:51 a.m. on a Tuesday, wheeled through the ER doors on a stretcher that smelled like diesel exhaust and morphine. His chart was already thick, post-op day 3 following abdominal reconstruction for an old IED injury from the Hindu Kush, the kind of wound that never really heals, just learns to scar differently. The paramedics had found him at his apartment near Fort Sam Houston with a fever of 104.2 and sepsis markers climbing like a fever dream. His name was Sergeant Major William Garrett, but Elena knew him by the scar tissue that mapped his abdomen and by the way his breathing changed when he was in pain, shallow and controlled, the way only combat veterans breathe when they're trying not to show weakness. She saw him the moment the ICU team passed her station on post-op recovery, saw the medals on a civilian jacket draped over the back of the wheelchair, saw his left hand gripping the armrest with the white-knuckled intensity of someone holding on to the present moment by sheer will. Her hands went still on the keyboard. 3.7 seconds of hesitation that felt like standing on the edge of a canyon. She could turn back. She could stay invisible. The folded flag in her locker had taught her the value of silence. But this was the medic who had carried it. This was the man who had pressed his forehead to her forehead in the rock dust of Kuna province and whispered, "I've got you. Always." And then he had taken her place on a supply run that changed everything. Elena waited 40 minutes for the shift transition, then made her way to the ICU with a purpose that looked routine, a nurse checking on a transfer patient, nothing unusual. Nothing that would trigger the surveillance that Dr. Pierce had methodically installed across the hospital's 3 surgical floors. She found the sergeant major's chart at the nurse's station and her eyes moved across the numbers with the precision of someone reading a language she had once spoken fluently. White count 14.7, CRP elevated at 8.3, and something else, something subtle in the recent vitals that the on-call resident, Dr. Chen, had noted but misinterpreted. Elevated jugular venous pressure. Fluid overload from the aggressive post-op hydration, Chen had written. Order furosemide. But Elena's fingers traced the echo report from 12 hours prior and found the spaces between the lines where a diagnosis was hiding. The report said inconclusive, which meant the radiologist had seen something they couldn't quite name, and Elena had named it 17 times in field hospitals where antibiotics ran out before the patients did, where she had performed emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife because there was no surgical tray and there was no time and there was a man drowning inside his own chest. She stood by the bedside for 90 seconds, her eyes moving across his face, searching for the confirmation that memory had not lied. The scar on his jaw. The way his left eye tracked movement even while he slept. This was him. This was the man who had carried her flag across the border into Pakistan because she had been declared killed in action and the only way to bring her home was to never bring her home at all. The door opened. Dr. Pierce stood in the threshold with the kind of timing that felt like a calculation. His eyes moved from the sergeant major to Elena, then back again, and Elena watched the moment the connection crystallized behind his pupils. This wasn't a routine patient check. This wasn't protocol. This was something personal. She felt his attention like pressure changing in a room, like the moment before an explosion when the air gets heavy and thin at the same time. She turned and walked back to her assigned unit without acknowledgement, without explanation, without the small courtesies that float nurses usually offer supervising physicians. The absence of those courtesies was louder than any protest could have been. By 6 a.m., Dr. Pierce was sitting in his Lexus in the hospital parking lot, the morning still dark enough that his silhouette was invisible against the leather seats. He had the number for Richard Hastings already dialed, the board chairman who owed him a favor for suppressing an incident report from 2019 involving Hastings' son and a pharmaceutical rep in a hotel suite. Pierce's voice was smooth as he explained the situation, each word positioned with the precision of someone building a case. "Richard, we have a patient safety issue that requires documentation. I have a float nurse, Elena Martinez, who's exhibiting boundary violations. I've documented a pattern. She's becoming emotionally invested in a high-profile military patient. This is exactly the kind of situation that creates liability." Hastings listened. Hastings always listened. And when Pierce finished, Hastings made a note and promised a review of the hospital's protocols around nurse assignments. By 8:16 a.m., Pierce had the number for the Credential Committee at El Paso Regional Medical Center, where Elena had worked for 4 years before she came to St. Michael's. His call was framed as a routine reference inquiry, professional to professional, just the kind of due diligence that a responsible hospital conducts. "I'm calling about Captain Elena Martinez, who worked in your ICU from 2018 to 2022. Any significant disciplinary issues? Scope of practice violations? We're just doing some protocol review." The director on the other end said no issues. She was an excellent nurse, very competent. Why, is there a problem? And Pierce said no, just routine, thank you, and hung up satisfied that no one had flagged whatever it was that Elena actually was, because whatever she was hiding it well enough that the people who should have known didn't. By 9 a.m., Pierce had filed a formal request for an external medical review team. The document was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision, citing a pattern of dangerous behavior, requesting an immediate assessment of nurse competency, and recommending immediate restrictions pending investigation. The committee approved it. They always did. A nurse questioning protocols was one thing. A nurse with boundary issues around a vulnerable patient was another. A nurse with possible mental health concerns masquerading as empathy was something that required response. That wasn't the worst part was the speed with which the hospital machinery moved once the wheels were set in motion. Within 2 hours, a memo had been placed in Elena's personnel file. Within 3, the charge nurse in the ICU had been given standing orders. Nurse Martinez is not to provide direct care for the patient in room 7 under any circumstances. Do not discuss this directive. If she inquires, refer her to human resources. Within 4, Elena's assignment had been changed. She was moved to post-op recovery on the 3rd floor, as far from the ICU as the hospital's geography would allow, where she would process discharge papers and check wound dressings and be completely invisible to the floor where a sergeant major's inflammation markers were starting to climb in a pattern that Dr. Chen was treating with diuretics when what he actually needed was an echo-guided pericardiocentesis and 17 years of field surgery experience crammed into the hands of a woman who was now assigned 3 floors away. Elena discovered the restriction when Linda, the ICU charge nurse, appeared at the nurse's station on post-op at 12:15 p.m., uncomfortable and apologetic in the way people are when they're delivering orders that don't make sense. "Elena, I have a directive. You're not to provide care for the patient in room 7. Direct orders from Dr. Pierce." Elena's hands continued moving across the keyboard, charting discharge notes with the mechanical precision of someone whose muscle memory had long ago learned to separate emotions from actions. She didn't ask why. She didn't protest. She simply nodded and acknowledged the order with the same composure she'd learned in field hospitals where arguing with command was a luxury that got people killed. But at 3 a.m., when the hospital quieted into that particular kind of silence that only night shifts understand, Elena pulled up the ICU vital signs monitoring system on her post-op workstation, a system she wasn't technically supposed to access, but that no one had actually restricted her from accessing, because no one had thought to separate clinical competence from institutional obedience. The numbers were telling a story. The sergeant major's jugular venous pressure had climbed from 8 to 12. His oxygen saturation had drifted from 94 to 91. His heart rate was steady at 104, compensating for something, working too hard for a post-op patient who should be recovering. She pulled the most recent echo from the system and read Chen's interpretation, inconclusive. Likely fluid overload. Recommend diuresis. And Elena knew, with the certainty of muscle memory and 17 field surgeries, that he wasn't drowning in fluid. He was drowning in his own pericardium, blood and serum pooling around his heart like water around a stone, and every diuretic Chen pushed was reducing the volume that was keeping pressure off the vessels that were keeping the sergeant major's heart from crushing itself. She could stay in her assigned lane. She could wait for Chen to catch it. She could trust the process and the protocols and the hierarchy that had taught her that staying invisible was the same as staying safe. At 4:17 a.m., she walked to the ICU. The charge nurse station was empty except for Linda, who had gone pale the moment she looked up and saw Elena approaching. "Elena, I can't. I need to check the latest echo on room 7. I can't let you." "I know." She was already moving, already pushing past Linda with the kind of authority that came from knowing she was right about something that mattered more than protocols or restrictions or the institutional machinery that Dr. Pierce had spent 3 days assembling around her. She found the sergeant major's chart and pulled the most recent echocardiogram, the one that Chen had ordered at midnight, and saw what Chen had missed. The pericardial effusion was no longer subtle. It was clear. A circumferential fluid collection around the right ventricle, a 1-liter compression of a heart that was running on reserves. This was pericardial tamponade. This was a man running out of time measured in hours, maybe less. She turned to go back to find Chen, to tell him, to somehow convince him without destroying herself in the process of being right. Linda was standing in her way, her hand raised, apologetic and firm at the same time. "Elena, I'm sorry. I can't let you do this." "Then get Chen. Get him right now." But at 6:13 a.m., while Elena was standing in post-op watching the sergeant major's vital signs populate on her monitoring screen, the numbers changed. His blood pressure, which had been holding at 118/76, dropped to 104/68. Then 94/61. Then 78/52, a stone falling through water, and Elena was already moving, already running, already pushing through the post-op double doors before the alarm had even finished sounding. The code blue alarm shrieked through the ICU like a scream that wouldn't die. For sharp bursts, then nothing, then again. Room 7. Monitor showing PEA arrest, pulseless electrical activity, the flat line that wasn't flat, just a heart that had forgotten how to squeeze. Elena was already moving before the overhead announcement finished crackling through the intercom, already pushing through the post-op double doors, already taking the stairs 4 at a time instead of waiting for the elevator like every other nurse on the floor. For flights. Her legs burned the way they used to burn crossing the Hindu Kush with ammunition on her back and somebody's brother bleeding through a field dressing. Muscle memory didn't work that way anymore, but her body hadn't gotten the memo. 3rd floor. 2nd floor. The stairwell door hit the ICU corridor at a sprint and she was there, bursting through the glass doors of room 7 where Dr. Chen stood frozen with one hand on the crash cart and the other suspended in the air like he was conducting an orchestra that wasn't playing. The sergeant major lay motionless on the bed, chest rising and falling from the ventilator alone. The monitor above his head showed electrical activity, QRS complexes marching across the screen in orderly rows, but no mechanical output, no heartbeat, no blood being pumped to a brain that was dying 1 oxygen-starved second at a time. Elena looked at the numbers. 94/61. Then 90/58. Then 82/49. Falling like a stone through black water. She looked at the narrow QRS complexes on the monitor and knew. Pericardial tamponade. The fluid around his heart was compressing it, choking it, suffocating the muscle from the outside while the ventilator pushed air in and his body couldn't use it because there was no circulation, no pump, nothing moving the blood. He needs pericardiocentesis. Now. Her voice came out level, factual, the voice of someone stating that water was wet. Dr. Chen turned to her, eyes wide. We need cardiothoracic on the phone. We need to call for an emergency transfer to. He'll be dead in 3 minutes. That wasn't an estimate. That was mathematics. That was the equation she'd solved 117 times in the Hindu Kush with nothing but a knife and a prayer and the weight of knowing that if her hands hesitated, somebody's child didn't come home. 90 seconds if she was slow. 2 minutes if she was scared. 3 minutes if she stood here talking about protocols and authorization and calling up the chain of command. She didn't wait for authorization. She moved the way she'd learned to move when waiting meant death, pure decision, zero hesitation. Her hand reached for the crash cart and grabbed the scalpel package, tore it open with her teeth, and her other hand was already prepping the subxiphoid area with betadine in 2 efficient circles. The smell of antiseptic hit her nose like a ghost. Like every field hospital from Kandahar to the Peck Valley. Like the smell of survival. The needle was already in her hand. 18 gauge. She positioned it at 45 degrees, aimed toward the left shoulder the way 117 previous patients had taught her, the way a man named Davies had helped her practice on a pomegranate in a phi base that didn't exist on any map. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, like they had their own memory, like they remembered exactly what to do when the lives stacked up faster than the minutes. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the room like breaking glass. Martinez, step away from that patient. He was in the doorway. His face was the color of a hemorrhage. His mouth was open like he was about to say something else, but the words caught because Elena's hands were still moving, advancing the needle slowly, feeling for the resistance change, the tactile feedback that meant she'd breached the pericardial sac. The entire cardiac unit pressed against the observation glass. 12 people. 14. More appearing by the second, drawn by the sound of a code blue that shouldn't have a resolution, shouldn't have a miracle, shouldn't have anything but a flat line and a body and paperwork and the slow acceptance of failure. Flash of blood in the syringe. Serosanguinous fluid. 60 cubic centimeters of pressure. 60 cubic centimeters of a heart that was being crushed. She withdrew the needle and the monitor changed like someone had thrown a switch. Blood pressure jumped. 96/58. Rising. 102/61. The QRS complexes deepened, became mechanical again, became the electrical output matched to a pump that was working. The heart monitor beeped. Beeped again. Beeped steady and regular like a metronome that had been stopped by his hand. 90 seconds. Total. The sergeant major gasped. His chest rose without the ventilator pushing it. His pupils reacted to the penlight that Dr. Chen held with shaking fingers. Alive. Not sleeping. Not dreaming. Alive. Pierce shoved through the door like a man possessed. His face was no longer hemorrhage-colored. It was something worse. It was the face of a man who had just watched his entire architecture collapse in 90 seconds. You just ended your career, he said, and his voice was very quiet now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. Everyone here is a weakness. She performed a surgical procedure without authorization. Without a requisition. Without even basic competency certification in cardiology procedures. He pointed at Elena like she was contaminated. Security. Remove her from this floor. Elena turned from the patient. She placed the syringe on the crash cart. She didn't look at Pierce. She didn't look at the crowd pressing against the glass. She looked at the monitor, at the numbers holding steady, at the man who'd carried her folded flag through mountains that wanted to kill him, and then she walked out of the room with the same pace she'd walked in. The calls came within 54 minutes. Board member Hastings received his first at 2:17 p.m. from Dr. Pierce, who'd somehow found an empty conference room and a phone line and the composure to sound concerned rather than furious. "I felt you should know about an incident this afternoon that raises serious patient safety concerns. Nurse Martinez performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a post-operative patient. We're looking at a potential suspension pending investigation." The words were careful. The implication was catastrophic. By 2:45 p.m., the external review team had received a call. By 3:10 p.m., St. Michael's previous employer in Dallas had taken a call about a pattern of boundary violations and a nurse who doesn't understand scope of practice. By 3:11 p.m., Elena's badge had been collected and she'd been informed that pending the outcome of the review, she was suspended without pay. By 6:36 p.m., her locker had been emptied and she was standing in the hospital laundry room with an armful of blue scrubs folded like prayer. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their mechanical hum. The washers rumbled through their cycles. The smell was industrial, bleach and starch and the ghost of 100 previous lives that had been washed and folded and worn and soaked in blood and alcohol and the residue of human suffering. Elena stood at the return bin and began to fold. First the top. Then the sleeves tucked in at precise angles, the way she'd learned to fold a uniform 17 years ago when she was still a person with a name and a rank and a future. The blue fabric was damp from the wash. It clung to her hands. Her hands that had held a man's liver together long enough for a helicopter to arrive. Her hands that had threaded a needle through an artery while bullets came through the window. Her hands that had just saved a life in 90 seconds and were now folding scrubs. The first pile went into the bin. Then the next. Then the next. 10 pairs. 12 pairs. The same precision she'd used to fold the flag, the one thing she'd been allowed to keep. The one object that proved she'd existed before all of this, before St. Michael's, before invisibility, before Dr. Pierce had decided that she was a problem that needed solving. She could feel the weight of it from here. The folded flag in her locker, in a paper bag, behind her street clothes. The only evidence. The only proof. It sat there like a secret that nobody knew to look for because nobody cared about a float nurse from nowhere with flat eyes and hands that never shook and a composure that was starting to feel less like strength and more like the slow suffocation of erasure. She stacked the final folded scrubs in the return bin and turned to leave. As she passed the ICU windows on her way out, she could see him. The Sergeant Major. Stable now. Sedated. The monitor showing regular sinus rhythm, blood pressure holding, oxygen saturation normal. The man who'd looked at her with recognition instead of dismissal. The man who'd carried her when she couldn't carry herself anymore. The man she would never speak to again because Pierce had activated patient safety protocols that forbade her from any contact with his case. She kept walking. The boardroom at St. Michael's sat on the 4th floor where the air felt different, thinner, sterile, the kind of space where reputations died quietly. Patricia Edmonds, the hospital administrator, had convened the disciplinary panel at 7:30 in the morning, her fingers already drumming the mahogany table where Elena would be stripped of her credentials. Dr. Pierce arrived early, his files organized like evidence at a trial, each page a small violence against the woman he'd been hunting for 3 days. He was winning. The external review team sat opposite him, reviewing his documentation of Elena's pattern of insubordination, and for the first time since the Sergeant Major crashed, Pierce felt his breathing settle into the rhythm of a man about to close a case. Then a Marine officer walked through the door. Captain James Ross, USMC, dress uniform crisp as a paper cut, moved with the economical precision of someone trained to enter hostile spaces. His presence changed the room's pressure like altitude shifting in an aircraft. Pierce looked up, confused, his hand pausing mid-sentence. "I'm Captain Elena Martinez's official representative," Ross said, his voice level as a surgical laser. "She has a witness to her character. The patient specifically requested his presence." The words weren't a request. They were a command. Patricia Edmonds blinked, then gestured to security to bring in the witness. Sergeant Major Michael Davies wheeled through the doorway in a hospital chair, pale as old bone, his chest wrapped in gauze thick enough to stop shrapnel. His eyes found Elena first, and something flickered in his expression, recognition, survival, a debt paid. She stood without moving, her hands at her sides, her composure locked down so tight the room might have been soundproof. Davies leaned forward, his voice rough as concrete, and whispered only loud enough for her to hear, "Reaper 6. The boardroom went silent. Not the comfortable silence of agreement. The kind of silence that happens when the room realizes it's been looking at the wrong person the entire time. Captain Ross opened a leather folder and began to read. His voice carried the ceremonial weight of military protocol, each word a hammer strike. Captain Elena Martinez, United States Marine Corps. Citation for Valor. Navy Cross recipient for actions conducted in Kuna Province, Hindu Kush Mountains, during Operation Nightingale, classified until this date. 17 field surgical procedures performed under sustained direct fire. 0 casualties among evacuated personnel. Classified rank held for 12 years under operational security mandate. Pierce's face drained then flooded red. He interrupted, his voice cracking at the edges, "This is irrelevant theater. We're discussing protocol violations, not," but Ross held up a hand, and Pierce's words died like a radio losing signal. The general had arrived. 2-star General David Mercer stepped through the boardroom door in dress blues, his presence occupying space the way apex predators do, not by loudness but by fundamental displacement of air. He didn't acknowledge the administrator or the board members. His eyes moved straight to Elena, and then he saluted. Not a casual gesture. A formal military salute rendered to a warrior, his hand crisp against his brow, held for the full count. His eyes held hers while his arm stayed raised, and the message was louder than any words, "I see what you are. You are visible." Pierce tried again, trying to reassert the narrative he'd been building for 3 days, trying to make the documentation in his hand still matter. "We were conducting a legitimate review of unsafe practice, General. If you'll just look at the incident report," but the general was already placing a phone on the mahogany table, extending the speaker like a benediction. The voice that came through was clipped, military, carrying the weight of federal authority. "Captain Elena Martinez, this is Deputy Director Sarah Chen of the Joint Special Operations Command at the Pentagon. Operation Nightingale is hereby declassified effective immediately. Your service record is restored, your rank recognized, and your medal is no longer restricted from public display. Welcome home, Captain." The line went silent. In the hallway outside the boardroom, a resident's phone buzzed. Then another. Then 6 phones, all at once, all showing the same video. Someone had recorded Dr. Pierce at the vending machine 3 days ago, his voice loud and cruel, his words now displayed under context that changed everything. The timestamp showed the moment. The date showed the why. A float nurse questioning a billing code before she knew she was saving a classified operative's life. A nurse refusing to discharge an unstable post-op patient before anyone understood why he mattered. The video cut to the moment Pierce finished his tirade, and someone overlaid text, "This is how Dr. Pierce treated Captain Elena Martinez. Navy Cross recipient. 17 field surgeries under fire. He called her a protocol violation." The video reached Dr. Marcus Webb at Johns Hopkins 43 minutes later. Webb was the man who'd written Pierce's medical school recommendation letters, who'd sponsored him for this position, who'd believed in him for 15 years. Webb watched the vending machine footage, watched Pierce's contempt, and picked up his phone. Patricia Edmonds answered on the second ring. Webb's voice was quiet, which made it worse. "I no longer recognize my former student. I am withdrawing my endorsement for the Chief of Cardiology position, effective immediately. I recommend a full ethics review. I recommend you treat this as urgent." Pierce's phone started ringing before noon. Board members who'd promised him leverage the day before were now distancing themselves with the precision of rats abandoning ship. Richard Hastings, who'd taken Pierce's call about Elena's safety violations, now sent an email recommending Pierce's immediate suspension pending investigation. The external review team, seeing the viral video, sent their own memo. They would now be reviewing Dr. Pierce's clinical decisions instead of Elena's. By afternoon, hospital security was walking him to HR with cardboard boxes. Elena watched from a hallway intersection as they escorted him past, his face the color of old concrete. Pierce saw her watching, and something desperate flashed in his eyes. He tried one last strike, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You think this changes anything? You're still just a nurse." Elena took one step forward. Her voice came out soft, measured, the voice of someone describing a historical fact. "I've performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife while people shot at me from 200 meters. I've extracted shrapnel from lungs with tweezers I boiled in stream water. You couldn't handle a nurse questioning your billing codes." She paused, let the word settle like sediment, then turned and walked toward the ICU. She didn't look back. That was the moment Pierce understood he'd lost, not when the general saluted, not when the Pentagon declassified his entire case, but when she turned away without even bothering to hate him. By evening, investigators discovered everything. The arrangement with MedSupply Solutions went back for years. Inflated billing codes on supplies that were ordered but never delivered. Consulting fees that were actually kickbacks. The hospital attorney froze his accounts within 6 hours. His wife received a call from their bank, credit cards declined. His lawyer sent a billing statement for $15,000. Everything unraveled in 72 hours. Pierce's medical license was suspended. The ethics review found 23 violations spanning back 8 years. Johns Hopkins issued a formal statement disavowing him. His assets were seized to pay legal fees and restitution. The only job that would hire him came 6 weeks later, driving a medical supply van for MedSupply Solutions, now under federal oversight, now managed by people who'd never heard his name. 6 months later, Elena stood in her new office on the 3rd floor of St. Michael's Hospital. The nameplate read, Director of Veteran Trauma Services. The office itself was small, deliberately modest, but the wall held everything that mattered. A glass case displayed 2 folded flags side by side, the one she'd carried from the Hindu Kush 12 years ago, and the one Sergeant Major Davies had carried in her absence. Between them, her Navy Cross, finally visible after 12 years in darkness. The medal caught the light like liquid bronze. Sergeant Major Davies walked past her office every morning, now employed as the VA liaison in the same program Elena had built. He recovered fully from his cardiac event. His hands moved without tremor again. He didn't need to say thank you. The salute he rendered on her first day as director said everything: recognition, respect, survival, the unspoken language of people who've held each other's lives in their hands. Dr. Pierce drove the hospital's loading dock twice a week, unloading boxes in a company uniform. Elena saw him once, his back bent slightly as if carrying weight that didn't have a name. She didn't stop. He didn't look up. They'd both moved on. The hospital held a ceremony. The general pinned her decorations on her white coat in front of news cameras, in front of staff who'd watched her be invisible. Dr. Chen, the resident who'd missed the pericardial effusion, thanked her publicly and asked her to lead a training on combat medical protocols. Patricia Edmonds announced a new hospital policy: all veteran staff could display their service records. Preference for leadership positions would go to those who'd served. Elena stood at the podium with a flat expression she'd worn for 12 years, but her hands rested steady on the wood, no trembling, no hiding. She spoke about the 17 field surgeries. She spoke about carrying the flag. She spoke about 12 years of invisibility. And then she ended with one sentence that somehow contained everything: true heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The audience stood. Every person in that room came to their feet. Sergeant Major Davies saluted from the front row, and Elena saluted back, and in that moment, the invisible nurse became what she'd always been: visible, recognized, home. Outside, Dr. Pierce loaded the last medical supply box into his van and drove toward the next hospital, toward the endless repetition of small humiliations. Inside, Elena walked back to the ICU where a new veteran patient had just arrived, and she got to work, visible at last, the flag in her office catching light like a promise kept. If you've ever been invisible because of someone's arrogance, if you've ever been underestimated and refused to let it define you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. What would you have done in Elena's position? Would you have let it go, or would you have waited for the truth to surface? Let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching the Code Whisperers.